Let's talk about switching to the Sony Alpha mirrorless system. Hello folks, I'm Juan Pons, and I just can't tell you how many comments, messages, emails, Facebooks, Instagrams I've gotten lately of people that are looking to switch over to the Sony Alpha mirrorless system. And I've gotten lots of questions about the different cameras, different lenses, what advice I would give them, how to go about the transition. In this video, I'm going to cover, my recommendations for gear, for lenses, for cameras, what the difference is, what things to look for, and the different paths that you can take for actually migrating from one system to another, for example from Canon or from Nikon. Now this video is for people who already made the decision to switch over to the Sony mirrorless system. I'm going to create another video talking about the differences or the advantages of moving not just to a mirrorless system, which I believe is the future of photography, but specifically to the Sony Alpha mirrorless system, which I believe, in my opinion, is the superior of the mirrorless camera systems that are out there. So look for that video. In the meantime, let's talk about, how to do a transition. Now, first things first, this is going to hurt. There is no question about it. Transitioning from a camera system that you may have been familiar with, that you may have been using for a very long time, is not going to be an easy transition. It's going to hurt financially, first of all. Unless you're going to downsize considerably and you're selling a lot of Canon or Nikon older equipment, switching to a system is going to set you back financially, a bit or quite a bit, depending on how much gear you end up going with. So that's something to consider. So be ready for that. But most importantly, keep in mind that there's a significant learning curve in learning a new system. You may have been using Canon or Nikon for a very long time, and you've learned the many systems, you'll learn the idiosyncrasies of the different systems and different cameras, different lenses, the buttons, the dials, all that kind of stuff, how to switch the camera into different modes. You may know those for your current system, but I will guarantee you the Sony is going to be different, and you're going to have to relearn all of that. It's going to take a while to do that. It took me about a year, and I did my transition about 4 years ago, and it took me about a year to really feel truly comfortable with the camera. And when I mean truly comfortable, is that I can change the settings in the camera without taking my eye off of the viewfinder. I know where the buttons are. I've developed that muscle memory, or I retrained my muscles, if you will, to press the right buttons on the camera. And I go out and shoot a lot. I'm out in the field quite often, travel quite a bit, teaching workshops, teaching camera techniques, teaching handling of the camera, all that kind of good stuff. So it took me quite a while to get there. So be patient. It's going to take you a bit as well. Don't rush it, but use the system as much as you can. That's the best way and the only way, really, to get good at it and to learn the system inside and out. Okay, as I see it, there are two ways of switching. The slow and methodically method, which is, by the way, what I did. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of how I went through this process. The second method is the ripping that band-aid off. That's going to hurt, which is really getting rid of all your other equipment and going for a whole new kit, a whole new system. This has advantages and disadvantages. I'm going to talk about those a little bit. Both of these do. So bear with me as we go through these. Let's talk about the slow and methodically method. This is, like I said before, this is the approach that I took. And what I did is I got one camera. At the time, that was the A6000. And I got familiar with that camera. And I got the kit lens, I got the kit system to see if I could work with the camera, work with the menus, work with the way that the cameras like to work. and see if it was something that I would like, and I would see also firsthand the image quality, the characteristics of the images or the raw files that were coming out of the camera, which to me was also very important. At the same time, what I recommend is that you buy, your most versatile lens, the lens that you use the most. For me, that was a 24-105, which was, what I call my stranded in a deserted island lens. If I was going to be stranded somewhere and I didn't have access to any other lenses, that would be the lens that I'd want to have. For you, maybe something different. So you have to figure out which one that is. And what this is going to do is going to force you to use this camera as much as possible, because you're going to have this one lens that you're going to be using in most situations. I also recommend that you buy a lens converter for your camera system. In the case of myself, I was a Canon shooter for many, many years, for decades. So I bought the MetaBones adapter that allowed me to adapt my Canon lenses to my Sony cameras. That way, when I wanted to use my 500mm, for example, I could use it with my Sony bodies. If I wanted to use a 16-35, or anything in between, I could adapt those and use those with my camera. Yes, there are disadvantages of the adapters in that the adapters are not going to be as fast. The autofocus is not going to be as responsive as the autofocus would be on a native lens, on a Sony lens, for example, or a lens that was specifically created and designed for the camera. There are a couple of different converters out there. Actually, there's many converters out there, but there's two types of converters. One is fully electronic converter, meaning that autofocus, aperture, everything works. There's communication between the lens and the camera. The camera knows, the lens that you're using, all that kind of good stuff. And there are some that are fully manual, that are really just a mechanical connection between the camera and the lens. So, I recommend that you get an adapter so that you can then slowly, over time, migrate from one camera system to the other without having to do a huge outlay of cash. As well as allowing your body and your mind to retrain itself to using a new camera system. So like I mentioned, for the Canon, I got a MetaBones adapter, which I believe is the best that's out there. Was very happy with it. It actually performed really, really well. For the Nikons, because I was a Canon shooter, I don't have specific recommendations for you for the Nikon. But what I do have is, I'll have that in the comment section, on the description of the video. I'll have a link to a blog article that Brian Smith put together, listing a lot of the different adapters that you can buy for the Nikon system. Again, I personally can't recommend any one of those because I really didn't use them, and I only like to recommend things that I have personal experience with. But take a look at those, and maybe perhaps contact Brian or ask other people that you may know that are Nikon users switching over to Sony, and see if they have specific recommendations. Now, you have to be strong with this method, because there's temptation to fall back to your old system. As you start using a new camera, you get a little bit frustrated, you miss some shots because you weren't quick enough at changing your settings. The temptation is really to fall back to your previous system because it's getting too hard. Do not fall to that temptation. Stay strong, do not fall back, continue moving forward. If you do get back, if for some reason you kind of cheat on your new camera system, get back on that horse, get back on the camera, start using it again. The only way you are truly going to be able to migrate onto a new system is by practicing, by using the system and practicing as much as possible. So, now, the idea here is that you are slowly switching all your lenses. In my case, for example, like I said, I bought, actually at the time there was no 24-105 from Sony, so I bought a 24-240 from Sony. And I was actually surprised that the image quality was comparable to my Canon 24-105 with that lens. But now there is a 24-105, which is actually the one I'm using to shoot this video with. And it's actually a brilliant lens, super fast, autofocus, sharp, just absolutely brilliant and very well made. I cannot recommend that lens enough. So that was kind of the first lens that I used. And then as I needed other lenses, I started migrating those little by little. Now, at the time when I did this, Sony, the longest lens Sony had was the 200 millimeter, the 70-200. Now, today, in fall of 2019, you have everything that you need, up to a 600, you have a 100-400, you have a 200-600, which is brilliant. By the way, I did an in-the-field review of that lens. If you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to check that out. You have wide-angle lenses from 16 to 35 zooms to prime lenses to even a 12 to 24 lens. I'm going to talk about this a little more. But again, the idea here is to then slowly switch your lenses as you get familiar with the system and as you need those lenses. So you may start out with your most used lens. Your next lens that you're going to transition to may be your second most used lens. It could be a 70-200 or it could be the 100-400. So again, the idea here is to take it easy, and as you use the system, you get more familiar with it, transition on those lenses, and it softens the blow a little bit, or at least stretches out the financial burden. Then once you get used to the camera systems and you like once you get used to the camera system, you like the lenses that you've bought, and you have picked up the lenses that you're, at least a few lenses that you're comfortable with, maybe you may start considering upgrading the camera. My advice is always to spend more money on glass, on lenses, than on the cameras themselves, because the glass is going to be crucial to creating great images. You could have the best camera in the world, but if you have, subpar or substandard lenses, the camera can only do so much for creating great images. So I would put my money on lenses than on cameras. But over time, then you can upgrade those cameras and maybe upgrade to, the camera you really wanted, which is the A9 or the A7R3 or something like that. Okay, let's talk about ripping that Band-Aid off and making a really, really quick transition. I would say that this is for people that financially can take the blow and can afford it. And maybe you're in that camp. Or for people that know that they won't be able to really do a transition, that they will fall back to their old systems. So again, financially, this is going to be pretty hard. But I would maybe start small, meaning that I wouldn't necessarily go out and replicate your entire collection, or you may, but maybe not. Maybe you may want to start small. Again, you may want to get rid of your old equipment so that doesn't pose any temptation, and then start small with a camera, a couple of lenses, and as you have the need, you can go and keep buying lenses as you need them. Nowadays we can order stuff and have it delivered to our house in a day or two. So, so it's not a bad thing to really start small and build up. And that way you only end up buying the kit that you really need. Or you could go ahead and replicate your entire lens connection. It's up to you and whether you are, that's something that you can do. Then the other thing that you may want to do is take the opportunity to optimize your collection. It may be that you have older lenses, and nowadays, for example, most of my lenses that I shoot with today, and I'll show you a list of my lenses, are zoom lenses. Zoom lenses nowadays are so good, they're so sharp. Back in the day, we used to say, there's nothing like a prime lens. And, to a certain extent, that's still true today. But zoom lenses are so good and so versatile that, I use them extensively. I only have a couple of fixed focal length lenses. I actually prefer zoom lenses nowadays because they're so good. So maybe this is an opportunity to optimize your kit and reduce the number of lenses that you have, reduce the size of and weight of your bag, of the lenses that you're carrying with you. Now, I just want to dispel a urban legend here, or the concept that a lot of people have that switching to mirrorless is going to make your kit smaller, a lot and a lot lighter. And yes, that can be true to a certain extent, especially if you're shooting with other types of mirrorless systems like Fuji or Panasonic or Olympus, or if you shoot with the crop sensor cameras from Sony and stick to the crop sensor lenses. I'm not shooting crop sensors. I'm shooting mostly full frame sensors. So physics being physics means that my lenses are going to be at roughly the equivalent size as they would be on a DSLR, on a full frame DSLR. That's not going to change. The lenses are going to be about the same size. They may be a bit lighter because they're using newer technology, newer composites. Maybe the lens itself is not metal, but it's a very strong plastic, there's nothing wrong with that. And then the camera bodies tend to be a little smaller on the mirrorless, Sony compared to a Canon or a Nikon, but it's not that much. I would say maybe 10, 15, 20% smaller, maybe a little bit lighter weight, but not significantly so. So don't do a transition. I know this is not really part of this video, but I just want to talk about this because I hear people talking about this all the time. Do not go into this thinking that I'm going to have a smaller system, especially if you stick with the full frame cameras from Sony. Your kit is, it's going to be a little smaller, but not significantly so. Okay, so let's talk about selecting a camera. So there are a bunch of different cameras from Sony that you can choose. There's the A7R III, which is an incredible camera. It's been around now for about a year, or maybe a little bit over a year. Actually over a year, sorry. And it's just a brilliant, brilliant camera. Dynamic range is incredible, has very good autofocus, but I'm going to go into detail on a lot of these. Then Sony recently released the A7R Mark IV, which I'm eagerly awaiting, should be here in a few days. So I'm really looking forward to that. There's also the A9, the A7 III, the newly announced A6600, again, this is a crop sensor camera, and the A6100. Yes, there are other cameras out there. There's the A6500, there's the A7S Mark II, the A6400. So there's a bunch of other cameras, but to me, these are the ones that I would be really thinking about, unless you have specific need. For example, there's some people that really need an A7S Mark II because they're shooting a lot of astrophotography or in really dark situations. And that camera excels in that area. The problem with it is only 12 megapixels, but you get so much better image quality at low light. That for you, that may be the one. But for most of people, these are the stable of cameras that you should be considering, and these are the ones that we're going to talk about. By the way, I own right now an A7R III and an A9. I've already ordered the A7R4, and I'm not sure yet which camera that's going to replace. It may replace my A7R III or it may replace my A9. I'm not entirely sure. I have to wait till I get the camera in my hands and I'm able to put it through its paces, test the autofocus to really find out which of the two cameras that's going to replace. Okay, so let's talk here about the A7R III. This is a 42 megapixel camera, full frame. Meaning that when you look at a lens and the lens says it's 24 to 105, that's exactly the focal length that you're going to get when you shoot with a camera. Has 10 frames a second, pretty nice, not super fast. I wish it was a couple more frames, maybe 11, 12 frames per second, but it still does pretty good. Very, very good autofocus system. Right up there, doesn't match the A9, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but it's still a very good autofocus system. But to me, what really sets this camera apart is the amazing image quality and the dynamic range that this camera produces. It's just mind-blowing, the image quality. And at 42 megapixels, I have a lot of room to crop if I need to as well. So the combination of 42 megapixels with an amazing image quality and dynamic range makes this a winner for me. And it's the camera I use probably 90% of the time. That's how much I like this camera. It has in-body image stabilization. So a lot of Sony lenses have image stabilization built into the lenses. And some of the cameras have image stabilization built into them as well. And you'd think, well, if I have IBIS, why do I need image stabilized lenses, or vice versa? Well, guess what? With Sony, these two systems work in tandem, and they help each other out in creating an even better image stabilized environment. The cost of this camera right now is $2,500, which actually is a good price compared to what it was when it first came out. I think it was somewhere like $3,200 when it first came into market. Don't quote me on that, I can't remember exactly. Okay, the next camera here, let's talk about this. The A7R Mark IV. Recently announced, about to be released in early September. Really excited, 61 megapixels. This is, right now, the highest megapixel mirrorless camera that's out there. Just incredible. And a lot of people say, well, I don't need 61 megapixels. I'm not printing huge prints or posters or whatnot. And that's true. However, what 61 megapixel gives you is more room to crop into the image, which to me is huge advantage. What this means is that, I can take a lens and, essentially extend my focal reach with it, because I'm able to crop into that frame some more. This camera also has an APS-C mode, which actually shoots at 24 frames a second. So at 24 megapixels. So, again, I would never do that because, I can just crop in the digital darkroom afterwards, and it's essentially the same thing. But to me, that's what's so exciting about this 61 megapixels, the fact that I can crop substantially into the frame and still have enough megapixels to do a nice large print. Again, this is another full frame camera, 10 frames a second. Now, to be able to capture these pictures at 10 frames a second, 61 megapixels, we have to have fast cards. And we're going to talk about that later on when we talk about accessories. Again, very good autofocus system. In the limited testing I was able to do with this camera, the autofocus system was better than the A7R III. Definitely not as good as the A9, but better than the A7R III, which is actually a very good autofocus system. So I would say that it does provide a very good autofocus response time and accuracy. Again, amazing image quality and dynamic range. As good, if not better, than the A7R Mark III. Just an incredible experience with this camera. Again, it has IBIS, in-body image stabilization, and this camera retails for $3,500, $1,000 more than the A7R Mark III. Okay, the A9, the flagship of the Sony Alpha system. 24 megapixels, kind of a modest resolution in the camera. Another, again, full frame as well. But what's really cool about this camera is that it can shoot at 20 frames per second. Just incredible. As a matter of fact, 20 frames per second is insanely fast. I've only really needed to shoot that fast on a few occasions. And I learned very quickly not to shoot at high speed, to shoot at medium speed, because at 20 frames per second, you can fill those cards up very quickly. But what's really cool about this too is that the camera has a very deep image buffer. What this means is that it can actually, you can shoot about 300 raw files in one burst of images, holding that shutter down. That's just amazing and incredible. It's going to then take a little while to offload those images, so you have to keep that in mind. The other thing that makes this camera just amazing is the autofocus. This is the absolutely best autofocus system that I've ever experienced, and really the best autofocus system that exists out there today. Super fast, super accurate, super responsive, is able to grab on birds in flight and hold on to them for dear life. Just incredible. It's actually kind of fun to use this camera, because your mind blows in how amazing the autofocus is, and how the whole sequence of images are always sharp with this camera, nicely in focus. The other thing that I love about this camera is the blackout free viewfinder. When you're using a DSLR and you're looking through a viewfinder, and as the camera is clicking off shots, the mirror goes up and down, your viewfinder goes dark and bright, and that can actually lead to you losing track of your subjects as they're flying. This camera, because it uses an electronic shutter, there's no blackout. You can see your subjects the entire time as you're tracking them through the air, or an animal that's running really fast, or an athlete running across a field. It is a game changer. It's just amazing. That electronic viewfinder, the other thing that it does have is that the camera is completely silent because there are no moving parts when it's taking images. So you can actually make the camera completely silent, and animals will know you're there. Nobody will know you're there taking a picture because it won't be hearing that clicking and clacking of the shutter or of the mirror. This alone is just incredible. Unfortunately, some of the other cameras don't have this feature as well implemented as it is on the A9. The A7R III and the A7R4 have something that's kind of like blackout free, but the image quality is reduced to a certain extent. Not the image quality itself of the raw file, but the quality of the viewfinder, the image that you see through the viewfinder. That does get reduced somewhat, so something to keep in mind. Good image quality and decent dynamic range. Again, not as good as the A7R III. And this to me is my biggest complaint about the A9, is that even though it's only 24 megapixels, the image quality just doesn't compare to the A7R III. The dynamic range is not there. So whenever I can, I reach for my A7R III for that image quality and that dynamic range. But when I need the absolute best in autofocus performance and super fast frames per second, this is the camera that I reach for. Also has in-body image stabilization, just like the A7's line. And this camera right now is at $3,500. Basically the same price as the A7R Mark IV. The A7 III. Now this camera is kind of like, it's been rated as the best bang for the buck, or the best value out there. 24 megapixels, which is very decent for this camera. Full frame again, 10 frames a second. Good autofocus system, not quite as good as the A7R Mark III, a little bit less responsive, but pretty good as well. So if you're doing landscapes or whatnot, this camera is going to work really well. If you're shooting birds in flight, this camera is going to be a little bit challenging, but it's still a very good autofocus system, just not as good as the A7R Mark III or the Mark IV. Great image quality and dynamic range on this camera, better than the A9, not as good as the A7R Mark III or 4, but very, very good image quality. Has in-body image stabilization as well. And the best part about this camera is that it's only $2,000. It's really a great deal for this camera. A great way to introduce yourself into the Sony Alpha family. Now the A6600, this is Sony's flagship crop sensor camera. Let's take a look at here at the specs. We're talking about 24 megapixels. We have an APS-C crop sensor. Again, this is 1.5 X crop, meaning that when you are trying to figure out the focal length of a lens, you need to multiply the focal length of the lens by 1.5. So for example, if using a 100 millimeter lens, your effective focal length is going to be 150 millimeters. We're talking about 11 frames a second. Incredible autofocus system. It actually borrows a lot from the A9, so the autofocus system is very similar to the A9. Not quite the same as the A9, but definitely better than the A7R Mark III. So this is a huge step up as far as autofocus is concerned. Good image quality and dynamic range, certainly better than any other crop sensor camera that's out there from any manufacturer, whether it's Olympus or Panasonic or Fuji. This camera produces a stellar image quality. It has in-body image stabilization also, which again is going to work in conjunction with those lenses that you may have. And this camera comes in at $1,400, an incredible value. This camera was just recently announced. It's not going to be available for a couple of months, but I think it's certainly well worth the wait. One thing that is really unique about this camera, compared to all the other cameras in the A6000 range from Sony, is that it uses the same battery system or the same battery as the A7 cameras and the A9. So if you're using a mixed set of cameras, this is a great camera to have with you because you can share the same battery versus all the other cameras in the 6000 line, the A6000 line, use a smaller battery system. Okay, another camera that Sony has recently introduced is the A6100. Beautiful camera as well. This is kind of their entry-level camera. You're still talking about 24 megapixels, an APS-C crop sensor, 11 frames a second, good autofocus system. I want to say it's probably on par from everything that I've read, because I haven't had time with this camera myself, but everything that I've read is probably on par with the A7R Mark III, maybe the A7R Mark IV, but definitely not A6600 or the A9. And it's got great image quality, same image quality as the 6600. I believe it uses the exact same sensor as the other camera, but it does not have any in-body image stabilization, no IBIS. So actually this camera is a little smaller than the 6600 and lighter weight as well, because it doesn't have those moving parts in there of the in-body image stabilization. But the great thing about this camera is that it's only $750. An amazing, amazing entry-level camera. So definitely something to consider. Okay, selecting lenses. And this is something that is actually highly personal. The type of photography that you do is going to force you to select a different set of lenses than, for example, I may have selected, because I'm primarily a wildlife photographer. I'm always looking for the longer lenses, like these guys back here, versus someone that may be exclusively a landscape photographer or a portrait photographer. Those types of photography are going to dictate the type of lenses you're going to be looking for. So that's something to keep in mind, that this is a highly personal. It's going to depend on the type of photography that you do. What I recommend, just like I mentioned earlier, is really to start with one of your most used or versatile lenses, the lenses that you end up using the most. Start off with that. That's going to be your best bet to make sure that you use this system as much as you can and get used to using this system as much as possible. Again, I'll repeat myself, and I'll mention taking this opportunity to reassess your needs and maybe slim down your choice of lenses. Take a couple of prime lenses that you had before and substitute it or replace it with one zoom lens. So something, this is a good opportunity to do that, something for you to think about. This is my personal lens kit. I use a Sony 24-105 quite a bit, like I mentioned earlier. It's sort of my standard lens that I use for a lot of different things. My primary wildlife lens is the Sony 200-600. This is a lens that was recently released. So I actually, as I mentioned before, I created a review online on this lens. I'm really, really excited about this lens. Haven't had the opportunity to use it as much as I want to, but I suspect this is going to be my primary wildlife lens. I also own the 100-400, which is an amazingly brilliant lens. Very, very sharp as well. It's a G Master and very responsive, great autofocus, fast autofocus with this lens. Having said that, my testing and a lot of other people's testing has shown that the 200-600 is actually a sharper lens than the 100-400. I also own, this is probably my oldest lens that I own, a Sony size, or what we call Zonies, 16-35 f4. And I use this a lot for wide angle landscapes, waterfalls, things that are nice and up close. I also own a Sony 12-24. that I haven't had the opportunity to use all that much. I'm looking forward to using it. And again, a brilliant lens. But one thing that I don't particularly like about it is that the front element on this lens protrudes. So it's hard to use filters on this lens. This lens is absolutely awesome, amazing. I love this lens, the Sony 90mm f2.8 G macro lens. I love doing macro photography. Don't do as much of it as I'd love to do, but I always have to have a macro lens on hand. And this is a brilliant lens, brilliant lens. Probably the sharpest lens I've ever owned. It's the sharpest lens Sony makes, and I think it's probably the sharpest lens out there today of anybody. It is absolutely mind-blowingly sharp. But the other thing that this lens is good for is a great portrait lens. When I need to shoot portraits, which is not often, this is the lens I gravitate towards, because it's it's got an incredibly creamy, smooth bokeh or out of focus areas in the image. So a really, really brilliant lens. And the last lens in my kit is the Venus Optics Loa 15mm f2.8. I use this lens pretty much exclusively for astrophotography. A 15mm is the right focal length that I like to use for astrophotography, and f2.8 gives me one stop of light more than f2. One of the great things about this lens is also that it has no distortion whatsoever. Amazing, amazing little lens. Okay, let's talk about lenses for you to consider. First one I want to mention, as I've said, I've mentioned this lens a number of times, the Sony 24-105. Brilliant lens, lightweight, very sharp, very fast out of focus, kind of, a walkabout lens. F4 G lens, I can't recommend it enough. I think everybody should have this lens. And this lens comes at about $1,200, maybe a little less than that, but $1,200 rounding up. Another lens that a lot of people really like is the Sony 24-70 f2.8 GM. This lens is certainly a lot more expensive. It's $2,200, $1,000 more than the 24-105. It's a bigger lens, heavier lens. If you do need that extra stop of light, by all means, but I think the 24-105 is a more versatile lens. Instead of going to 70, it goes out to 105. With how good these cameras perform nowadays at increased ISO levels, I don't hesitate at all shooting, a higher ISO if I need to. So that's why I prefer the f4 than the 2.8. So that would be my recommendation, the f4, the 24-105, unless you really, really need that low light performance or the super shallow depth of field of f2. Another set of lenses to consider is the Sony 70-200 f4. Sony has two and f4 that comes in at $1,400, or a f2.8, which is a GM lens at $2,600, quite a bit more, $1,200 more, almost twice as much. And again, the same thing applies here between the other lenses that we just looked at. My recommendation, if you need a lens in this range, is to go with the f4, because it's going to be lighter weight, smaller, cheaper. It's still a sharp lens compared to the f2.8, unless you really need that f2.8. It's hard really for me to talk about these lenses because I don't own one of these. This is a range of lenses that I don't really use all that often. I usually want something wider or something longer. So that 100 to 200 is not really an area that I shoot a lot in. So for me, it's really not a lens that I use. But if you have a need for this area, these are the two lenses that I can certainly recommend and what the price points are. Now, for wildlife, we have a number of options from Sony. Sony has a 400-8 as well as 600 f4. But those are big, heavy, super expensive lenses. And yes, I used to own a Canon 500mm f4, and that was my most used lens for a long time. But that lens is big, heavy, bulky, and super expensive. I've actually opted now for using one of these two lenses. For the past few years, I've been using the 100-400 with a teleconverter. That actually has been a really, really good system for me. I've been able to shoot at so that reaches out to 560 millimeters. You end up at f8, which is not optimal because, for example, the A7R Mark III is not able to focus track at f8. So that's something to really think about and consider. I really love the 200 to 600. I think this is going to be my primary lens, as I mentioned earlier. But there's some reasons to go for one over the other. So I still have both. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with my 100-400. The biggest thing is the 100-400 gives you a much smaller minimum focusing distance, meaning I can focus on things a lot closer than I can do with the 200 to 600. What that means is that the 100-400 will, can serve as a kind of, macro lens in a pinch. I can shoot insects that are pretty close and have a really nice magnification on my viewfinder. So if you find yourself needing something with a close minimal focus distance, certainly 100-400 is going to be better than the 200 to 600. But for everyday wildlife, the 200 to 600 I think is going to be my choice. Now, the other thing to consider here is using the Sony 1.4x teleconverter. I think this is going to be an essential piece of kit, whether you're using the 100-400, and people are using it with the 200 to 600 as well. I haven't really done extensive tests with that yet. That's on my plate of tests to do, and I will have a video on that when I do that test. But in a pinch, I will certainly use it if I need to. If it's the question between not getting an image and getting an image, I'll slap on that teleconverter in there. Super sharp teleconverter. The combination of the 100-400 with the 1.4 teleconverter is insanely sharp, and the focusing works pretty well, especially with the A9. Is incredibly fast, and the A9 is able to focus track with the 100-400 and the 1.4 teleconverter in it. So the question will be whether the A7R3 Mark IV is going to be able to focus track with that. I have not been able to verify that yet. I hope that it does. I think it will, but I'm not 100% sure. So a couple long lenses here for you guys to consider. Okay, so let's talk about wide-angle lenses. We have this, as I mentioned earlier, this Sony size, or Sony 16-35 f4. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I think this lens I have right over here somewhere. Here it is. It is not the sharpest lens that I've had in this range, but I use this focal range so seldom that for me it's fine. It's a nice small lens, compact, very nicely built. It does focus really fast, and comes in at $1,250. So pretty nice little lens, something for you guys to consider. If you really want the best in quality, I would then consider the Sony 16-35 f2.8 G Master. This lens comes in at $2,200. Very expensive lens, really big and heavy. But if this is a range that you shoot with a lot and you really need that 2.8, or you really want the sharpest lens, this lens is certainly going to beat the 16-35 f4. So it's really up to you as to what works for you between these two. But the other one to consider, as I mentioned earlier, is the Sony 12-24 f4G lens. And this is this comes in at $1,700. Really versatile zoom range, I have to say. That extra 4 millimeters compared to the 16 makes a big difference. 12 millimeters is quite large, quite wide angle lens. But as I mentioned earlier, my biggest pet peeve with that lens is that the front element protrudes, bulges out, so it's hard to put a filter system on that lens. Couple of things to consider, as I mentioned earlier, the Sony 90mm f2 macro lens, that comes in at $1,000. Probably the best bargain out there. Super sharp lens, very fast out of focus. One of the features that I really like, and not sure I have this lens here, one of the features I really like about this lens is that the focus ring in the front actually you can activate manual focus just by holding onto the lens and moving that ring up and down. When it's forward, the camera is on autofocus. When you push it down, then you're in manual focus. Really, really helpful when you're shooting macro. It's got a limiter with 3 settings, which also helps when you're doing macro work. It's got in-body image stabilization, or in the lens image stabilization. As I mentioned, probably the sharpest lens that's out there today. Certainly the sharpest lens from Sony. The other lens that I really enjoy is that I mentioned that Venus Optics Loa 15mm, and that's this lens here. Nice and small lens. It's quite heavy because it's made out of metal. Comes in at $850 US. It is a fully manual lens, manual focus, manual aperture. But for me, that's fine, because when I'm shooting astrophotography, which is what I use this lens for, I'm shooting everything manual anyways. So that's no big deal to me. If you do a video, this lens is actually really nice as well, because you can de-click, if you will, the focus ring, so you can smoothly change, not the focus ring, sorry, the aperture ring. So you can change your aperture smoothly as opposed to in increments and clicks, which is optimal for video work. Really nice, super sharp. As I mentioned earlier, it also has absolutely no distortion. Beautiful, beautiful lens. Something else for you guys to consider. And then lastly, it is the lens adapter. This lens adapter from, there's a couple lens adapters. Actually, there's many types of lens adapters out there, many different brands. The one that I like the most, and the one that is widely recognized to provide the best performance for Canon lenses, is the Metabones adapter. And this adapter comes in at $399. What's cool about this adapter is that it has a USB interface. So you can actually upgrade the firmware on the adapter. And over the years that I've owned this adapter, Metabones has come out with a lot of different updates to it, which has increased or improved the autofocus performance substantially. So it's great to see that this adapter that I've had for a long time has actually improved over the years by updating the firmware on it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if you shoot Nikon, check the link I'm including in the description below for a number of options that Brian Smith recommends. Again, I'm not a Nikon shooter, so I could not advise you as to which one is the best, like I can with a Canon. But you can certainly ask other people out there. Now, let's talk about essential accessories. Besides the lenses and the cameras, there's a few other accessories that you're going to need as a Sony shooter, as a new system. And the first one is going to be your batteries. All the cameras that I mentioned earlier use this type of battery, the Z, we call them the Z type batteries. They're bigger than the old Sony batteries. So all the cameras that I talked about earlier, except for the last one, the 6100, they'll use this larger battery, which is great because if you have multiple cameras, you can then interchange the batteries. Another accessory that's super, super important is fast memory cards. I can't stress how important this is. And I'm sorry, yes, you're going to have to upgrade your memory cards. The Sony cameras use a new standard of SD cards. It's called UHS-2. And what's important about the UHS-2 cards is that they have much, much faster read and write speeds. If you look at the back of a UHS-2 card, they have a second row of contacts, and that allows the camera to write, to offload images onto the card a lot faster. The ones from Sony out there are the fastest that are out there. You can actually see on the label here that these can write at 299 megabits per second and read at 300 megabits per second, or megabytes per second, sorry. Now, there are other UHS-2 cards out there, but pay attention. Some of them may be able to have read speeds of 300, but the write speeds may be down to, I've seen them as low as 150. So, and that's really where you care. You want to offload that camera buffer so you have more room to take more shots. Having a fast memory card is super important to make sure that you offload those images as quickly as possible. couple other accessories here to talk about is the card readers. You're going to need to upgrade these card readers as well so that you can take advantage of this fast cards when you're downloading images to your computer. And I have two card readers here for you guys that I can recommend. Sony makes a card reader that's USB 3 that you can use in, most laptops are there. This thing is super cheap, costs $25. No reason not to own one. And then SanDisk makes a USB Type-C, or USB-C card reader as well. That's UHS 2 compatible. Again, $25, super fast, easy to get. And absolutely essential to make sure that you don't you download those images as fast as possible to your camera as well. Now, another accessory that I can rent to you guys, and I think it's essential, is this new MOA dual battery charger. It costs $13 or something like that, and I'll have links for all these products. And this charges two batteries at once, and it uses a USB connector to charge. So you can use the same charge cable that you have to charge other USB accessories, whether it's your phone or whatnot, in an adapter. And what this does, it allows you to charge two batteries at once. It's not as fast, but for $12 is something to have with you, and you can charge two batteries at once. I mean, easy, can't be beat for 12 bucks. Absolutely essential as far as I'm concerned. And this is the new MOA dual USB charger for the Z batteries. The other thing that I highly recommend are going to be lens scope protective gear for your lenses and your cameras. We spend so much money on these lenses that I think it's essential really to protect them. A lot of people do these to, they think that they're going to hide from the animals and whatnot. The animals can see, they're very perceptive, they can detect motion pretty easily. For me, these protective gear, this neoprene cover from Lenscoat, what they do is actually protect my gear from nicks and scratches and bumps to make sure it lasts longer and it stays looking better for the time when I do need to sell it after the fact. So definitely something to consider for all of your gear. Okay guys, a couple more accessories that I want to talk to you about. First is the Really Right Stuff plates, especially the L plates for the cameras. And I mention this because I'm asked about this all the time. Really Right Stuff makes the best plates for the cameras, and they make plates for each camera as it comes out. This plate here this is the A7R Mark III. You can see the L plate that goes on the camera, and I love these L plates because it makes it easier and quicker to mount my camera on my tripod head or my ball head, because it's Arca Swiss compatible. It's got an Arca Swiss compatible plate at the bottom and on the side, so that I can move my camera from horizontal to portrait mode very quickly without having to flop the ball head out and have my camera off axis. The other thing that this camera does that for me works really well, or that this plate does, sorry, that works for me very well, is that it adds maybe half an inch or 3/4 of an inch more to the length of the grip on this camera, which allows me to put my finger, my pinky there, and it provides a much surer connection, if that's a word, a much more firm connection to the camera. So absolutely every camera that I own always has a Really Right Stuff L plate. Now, also want to describe the replacement foot for the lenses as well. Yes, the Sony cameras come with a foot that has holes in it, so you'd have to put a plate on top of that. What I prefer to do is actually to get a replacement foot. It has, I think, a stronger connection to the lens itself than just putting a plate on the foot that comes with the camera. But also, it makes it a lot easier to carry because these are much longer than the foot that comes with the camera, the lens itself. So it's easier to carry out in the field. Now, this foot is the foot that works with the 100 to 400 as well as the 70 to 200. The 200 to 600 lens, which is over here, has a different foot altogether. It's a little bit bigger, so it's not interchangeable with the 100 to 400 or the 70 to 200. The other thing that I also want to talk about, and I'll have links on the show, on the description, is the tripods that I use, because I'm asked this question all the time, and I was asked questions on some of the other videos that I posted. I use really right stuff tripods. I use the TVC 24L as well as the TVC 14, I believe it is, the 1 series. The 24L is my standard tripod, nice and tall, and the L makes it extra big, which I like for when I'm shooting in uneven terrain. Makes it a lot easier to set my camera up. And the 1 series I use for traveling. It's actually a nice little sturdy tripod, folds very small. So if I'm shooting landscapes and I'm traveling and I don't want to carry the big tripod, I'll use the little one with me. The Arca Swift P0 ball head is a new type of ball head that I absolutely love. You have to look at it and appreciate it. It's actually an inverted ball head design that makes it very versatile for landscape photography as well as general photography. Again, I'll have links to all of these things in the video description below so you can check them out. So that's it, folks. I hope that you found this video helpful in your transition into the Sony Alpha mirrorless system. If you enjoyed this video and you like what you saw and you'd like to see more, make sure to subscribe to my channel and click on that bell so that you can get notified whenever I post new videos. So until next time, take care, folks.